Matthew Buckley-Smith, and you're listening to Slee Ricketts. Thank you all for listening, and thank you especially for those of you who've taken a moment sometime this past week to recommend the show to a friend. That is really the way people learn about the show, and it's how we've gained a slow but steady number of listeners lately. Welcome to all of you. I should say, if you are new to the show, this should be a fun episode to listen to on its own, but it probably will be even better if you first listen to episode 90, which is called Neo-Georgian Hellscape, because at least a large part of this episode is essentially a response to that episode. Cameron, one of my co-hosts, in that episode made some sometimes perhaps excessive attacks on the new formalism and several of its practitioners. And Brian Brodeur came this week, author of Some Problems with the Autobiography, a book of poetry, and which is, you should pre-order now. I think it's not quite out yet, but you can pre-order it, as well as To Crawl Under the Earth, a long essay on expansive poetry, which is sort of a slightly clumsy term meant to incorporate both the new formalism and narrative poetry. It's sort of the new narrative, but then there's another movement called the new narrative, which apparently is a completely different thing. At any rate, Brian came on to talk a little bit about new formalism broadly, and specifically to respond to some of Cameron's claims. He also very kindly put together a little mini anthology of new formalist poems. I think it's 12 poets. Most of the poems we talk about are from that anthology, and rather than try to track each of them down individually, I just created a link so you can see the whole anthology that Brian created. So that is in the show notes. It's called Do-Not-Delete, and that's available in the notes as a link to a file. So I hope you enjoy that. I did. I also got a really thoughtful, I had a nice exchange actually with Sam Gwynn, who publishes as R.S. Gwynn. He's a prolific and well-respected poet who Cameron was pretty hard on. Gwynn responded sort of first, not really to say anything about Cameron's criticism of his poetry, but to say that Cameron had recounted a story in which Sam dismissed, I think it was, he claimed that he dismissed Ted Hughes' book Crow as trash. And Sam's response is, that he says he has disparaged poems before, but he just says, I don't think I've ever called a poem trash, let alone a whole book. He also says, and I've never rejected a poem on the basis of its being free verse or whatever the operative term is now. It sounds like he's not a huge fan of Hughes's, though he has some admiration for him. He says probably Plath is the better poet. And he goes on to say that like both the terms new formalism and the term and expansive poetry are not especially dear to or persuasive for him. I think he would just as soon be done with all of that. And I think from his perspective, the whole debate over new formalism and the poetry wars of the late 90s and early noughts, I think, are to him old news and not especially interesting. But he was really generous in his response to the show overall, and I'm hopeful that he will come on and do an episode with me at some point. But that to say, do go listen to episode 90 and then listen to this episode, in which you will hear vindicated, among other poets, Sam Gwynn. Brian brings in a really great poem of his, and we get to talk about that at some length. So I hope you enjoyed this. This was a really good, long, dense conversation, and so I did break it into two parts. If you'd like to hear the second part, then just go to sleerickets.substack.com. Sign up for the secret show. If you put your email address in, I will give you a week's access for free to the 30-odd episodes that are up there now. That's 3 extra episodes a month. So if you like the show, but you would like a little more, then sign up for the secret show. It is pretty fucking cheap, and you get a bunch of extra Slee Ricketts. That is, as I said, where the second half of this episode will go up probably sometime this weekend. I'm going to be traveling, but I'm going to be putting that, I'll put that up soon. I think that's all the stuff I needed to say. I'm tired as shit and I have a flight in the morning, so I'm gonna call it there. You wrote the piece, is it crawling?
I think it's to crawl under the
Crawl
earth?
under the earth. That's it. Yeah, because it's from the Mason poem
Mason,
about this is the one about the Civil War.
yeah, that's right.
So yeah, so you wrote To Crawl Under the Earth, which was this long piece in the Hopkins Review a while ago about expansive poetry, which we talked about as sort of narrative and new formalist poetry. Cameron and I talked a little bit about that and a little bit about some other things, and he took some hard swings at the new formalists and at the larger category. And I had been planning to have you on, but I thought it'd be good to get some of your responses to that. You could straighten out young Cameron and fill us in on some things we might be missing. Any things we should just get?
Yeah, the one place I think would be fun to start, which certainly would lead us into the anthology, is like basically the conspicuous absence, I think, in your conversation about new formalism, especially Cameron and his outright dismissal of new formalist poets was, especially of the kind of the OG new formalists.
Right. Yeah.
was poems. I mean,
right.
So it was, with a so I want to make a point to kind of talk about that. And then I have a couple of things that, like, I thought his points about Hopkins' letter to Robert Bridges and the Parnassian style and Gerard Manley Hopkins's, 4 different kinds of or levels of poetic language, I thought was kind of interesting. And I thought that Cameron's idea about new formalists being Parnassian was interesting, but then I also wanted to question his definition of Parnassian, which I just don't know where he got it. I like where he kind of took it, and maybe it's his own spin on Parnassian verse or language, but I was kind of curious. But anyway, that might be something.
Okay, all right, yeah. Good. Yeah. Well, and so you're right that conversation somehow became it was like the champions that were arbitrarily designated to determine whether or not new formalism was valid were like Bill Coyle versus Gerard Manley Hopkins somehow, which was not. Right. I don't think it was really fair to anybody, but yeah,
no.
It was
Bill would have laughed about it too.
Right? Yeah, I imagine so. Just quickly, I wanted to mention that I got a couple of notes. One from Andre Hewlett. He had a few things to say. He did among them, right? Because he, I think, mostly writes free verse poetry. He wrote, "Who are some innovative living formalist poets I should read? I have my 20th century heroes of formal exploration, but when I encounter contemporary formal poetry, I often think that sure is a lot of rhymed meter. It feels old-fashioned to me. However, I admire the use of form in poems like, oh, right, yeah, haha, flattery. Who's out there doing the funky stuff?" And then I also got, as if almost in answer, a note from Alfred Nickel saying, in answer to Cameron's question, are the new formalists all white? He says, among the best young poets writing in form are Nosheen Yusuf, Jenna Lee, Taylor Bias, Erica Dawson, Natasha Trethewey ranks among our best poets of any stripe in the U.S. Arguably the most important publisher of formalist verse in the U.S. is Alex Pepple. I think you're right to think that new formalism has outgrown any clubbish exclusivity that might have been attached to it. I wouldn't be sad to see it lose the new formalist label as well. So that's at least a partial answer. And I know you've also got an answer in this. You sent me this little, sort of small anthology of some poems by a handful of new formalist poets. And I think what I should be able to do is just make this, I think I can set it as a link in the show notes so people can take a look at the poems you selected. But we'll talk about some of those. And in answer to Andre's and Alfred's comments and any of those broader questions, anything you want to, as the as the designated defender of new formalism.
I guess first I should say, I guess it's fair that I find myself in this position of defender or apologist.
I mean, you wrote the big expansive poetry essay. That's you threw down a gauntlet.
I did. Yeah, I did. I guess it's my fault, but it is a little. I do think it is a little. I don't know. Precarious and strange, but yeah, I would say some other names that we could mention in terms of diverse voices who also write very accomplished poems in meter and rhyme. Alexa Sears would certainly be one, who just published her first book, I believe, in 2020 or 2021.
Yeah, so
Which
that's
is a
done
really
done very well in sales too. It's yeah,
it has, it has.
out of order with, I think, shit, is it Autumn
Autumn
House?
House,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, Autumn House, yeah. Nichols named some really fine
yeah.
uh, fine poets. So
Yeah.
probably in a couple of minutes, I'll think of 3 or 4 others.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah. And I
oh,
should say,
Amit
in that
Majumdar.
list, Amit Majumdar, of course.
Amit
Yeah, for
Majumdar,
some
certainly.
reason, we in like a couple of conversations about new formalism recently, he has not come up. I think I talked with Austin about some of this, and Amit also did not come up there. But yes, I think it would be, you'd be amiss if you did not
Oh,
note him. I'll also just note for listeners and anybody who knows any of these people that Nasheen Yusuf, Jenna Lee, Taylor Bias, Erica Dawson, Natasha Trethewey, I will say over half of those I have invited on the show, and at least one is going to be coming on. So if anyone knows people, I always appreciate some nudges to bring some of these fine poets in for conversation.
And also Shane McRae, of course, too.
Yes, yeah.
You can't, lest we forget. I think he's such a I don't know, like conspicuous master or something that
right.
that might be why I forgot to mention him. Because he's just so prolific and he's so good, and he's also so distinctive in terms of his own style. Like sort of a thing.
Yeah. Well, and and I think the also the more accomplished any poet is, the less he's going to be easily defined by any group to which he might belong.
That's right.
So yeah, but you chose a selection here of, these are, I would say, like, are these all like proper capital N, capital F new formalists? Like they're sort of an older generation for the most part. And you also, since you spoke in your essay about the category of expansive poetry, which I've expressed some skepticism of, just like the ability of that label to work, because of both it sort of it feels like an accommodation, and it also just feels like it hasn't caught fire yet. But yeah, what would you have to say about how we define any of these terms?
Well, I like your comment that you made on the New Formalist episode, where you were like, here's the flaw in that label, expansive poetry or expansive poets. The decision to call them new expansive poets was made by committee.
Well, right. Which like we don't want to exclude the new narratives, but then shit.
It is so funny, and it is kind of I don't know, sort of silly in that respect. I mean, how almost overdetermined it all is. But at the same time, I would say, but at the same time, we also cannot deny the fact that it's sort of a fact of literary history that this happened, and also that anthologies have been made with that title in mind, and that many essays and even critical books have been written with that label. And the reason why, and as possibly vague and even I mean, you could interpret it as a kind of misnomer as well, as that term expansive poetry may be, and I certainly I can see how you could interpret it that way.
Sure.
Still, I think it does open up the term, I don't know, new formalist, which is a little limiting, as Nichols mentioned in his, or intimated in his comment, and as of course you have a number of times, and other poets who write in meter and rhyme have expressed their, I don't know, regret that it even exists. But it is, but also I think Mary Jo Salter said or wrote once somewhere that it was in response to someone asking her, well, what do you think about being lumped in with the new formalists? And she was like, well, I mean, maybe it's problematic, but also it's a matter of convenience, in the sense that it's good for poets who are lumped into a group with other poets, simply because the possibility of them being read and actually their work actually lasting is a little bit higher than those who are just sort of floating off on their own without any such associations.
No, I
So,
think I think that
yeah,
yeah, that totally makes sense, and that's like another version of the Matt Wall justification. Like it's a Wikipedia category.
exactly.
It's a way to refer to people, and so in that sense, it is useful. What occurred to me is that like because particularly if you want to include the new narrative poets and looking at this anthology, I think you see some of both of those influences in here, even if all of these I think are, or at least most of these are at least nominally formal. Some of the Dana Joy ones sort of stretch the definition,
Yeah.
but they are, you also have a fair number of longish narrative poems in here. What occurred to me is what we really need is for there to have been a really iconic magazine that you could name them after, because I think of like the Fugitives or the Language Poets. In both cases, those are named after both fairly short-lived magazines that were associated with a group of people. And so that's what's sort of missing. Like if there had been just some magazine that could have been called anything, then they would be the That Poets, and that
Right.
would be a little snappier maybe.
Yeah, there was I mean not obviously a magazine, but there was Storyline Press, which published
Right.
a lot of the new formalists. And actually, I just interviewed Shane McRae for the AWP Writers Chronicle. That
Hmm.
interview should be coming out, oh, I don't know, next couple of months.
Okay.
But anyway, Shane said something which I had no I had never heard before. But he grew up in the town where Storyline was based.
Oh.
On the West Coast, it was either Washington or Oregon, and so like his early exposure to poetry in those formative years was all Storyline poets. So,
Oh.
so it's all like Shane has the kind of strange and possibly dubious, but certainly interesting distinction of having come from that kind of a background of like, oh,
Wow.
this is what contemporary poetry is. It's new formalist poets. So,
Yeah,
so
that's
it's
no, that's
really interesting.
wild. I mean, that's also, and I don't know. I mean, he's obviously written a lot about it, and he's got a memoir coming out soon because he's the most
Yes.
prolific man on earth. Except I guess like Shane and Amit are neck and neck now for most prolific human being alive,
Yes.
at least writing in English. But he's written some about the. I mean, I don't know all the particulars, but the people who raised him, who were not his parents, were, if I recall, like hard right national, like white nationalists,
Oh wow.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that makes me somewhat anxiously wonder about like the proximity of like it's like given the for the most part quite unfair stereotypes about new formalists being arch conservatives, or in some cases like paleo. I mean, like the Joseph Salome, Anton Yankovic crowd. Actually, well, yeah,
I know.
maybe.
I pictured now. I'm picturing Storyline. This is anathema. This is not at all correct. But just as a sort of imaginative exercise, I picture Storyline being like in a bunker in the in the
Right.
Cascades or something.
Well, no,
Like,
I'm one. I don't know. I'm actually thinking of like. Did you see the movie Green Room?
no, I haven't seen it.
Oh, fucking great movie. Great, like the great late great what was his name? Anton Yelkin, the kid who died very young, but it's just like a really taut, brilliant grindhouse movie starring Patrick Stewart as a white supremacist, villain.
Oh,
But it starts with this little punk band doing a show in a weird compound that turns out to be a neo-Nazi compound, and then they get stuck there and have to fight their way out. And I was just thinking, like, you could do that, but it'd be like a bunch of traveling poets accidentally give a poetry reading at a white supremacist poetry compound, and then they have to machete their way through legions of racist poetry fans.
do not go gentle into that good night. I'm picturing like
Yeah.
Patrick Stewart with his appropriately neo-Nazi haircut. Uh,
Right. Yeah. Exactly. He was typecasting in that sense, at least.
right. Oh
Uh,
god, no, I have to.
wow.
I have to see that film now. I
It is
think.
really good. I mean, it's strong. It's definitely not a date night film, but it is really very well done. All right. So, do you want to jump into this anthology you sent? This, and this is sort of a. I do. I think like I kind of want now because I have like Jonathan and I have talked about this some off mic, but I really want there to be. I want a trend, whether it be in individual anthologies, selected poems, or even in larger anthologies of hyper selective collections. Like I want
anthologies that are the length of a normal poetry book. I want you, if you do a new and selected of 4 books of poems, I want 25% from each book.
Right.
Like, and I like, because I think it's more likely for people to read it. And I also think if what you want to do is like send people toward the work, just pick like the hits.
Yeah.
Pick like absolute killers, and then people will go read more. Yeah. But I mean, you sent like a 60-page little casual anthology titled, I think, wonderfully, Do Not Delete, which is like helped because it was a PDF document when I got it. But I think like I kind of want this to be a real anthology where you just like very small, urgent, unpretentious, and just like straight to the point. But yeah, please. So give us this is sort of your case for new formalism, so to speak.
Oh, I mean, it's one version of my case. I mean, this is sort of, I just sat down one afternoon and just kind of flipped through a bunch of books that I happened to have in my office, and was like, okay, these are really good poems that I wouldn't want to lose.
Sure, yeah.
And so, I should say too, the title "Do Not Delete" comes from a Rina Espaillat sonnet.
Oh, so, that's right. Yeah, are you sure you want to exist? Right. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Are you sure you want to exist? Which is a Freudian slip for, are you sure you want to exit? Which is the message that you get sometimes when you're trying to click out of something. Whether it's
yeah. That's true. No, I forgot. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't remember that. But yeah, that's true. So it does come back. But I thought it was a good anthology title.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so I think it's 12 poets and I can't remember, like 28 poems or something like that.
Something like that.
And these range from, the OG, they're all kind of new formalists. Mm-hmm. So Dana Gioia and Timothy Steele and Mark Jarman, R.S. Gwynn, but then also folks who are only sort of loosely associated with new formalists, mm-hmm. and thinking of Kim Adenizio, Rafael Campo, Jared Carter. Jared Carter is a poet who I think not a lot of folks really know about.
I did not know him before.
Yeah, he's actually an Indiana poet. He writes poems. Almost all of his poems, in the way of he writes about a kind of fictionalized town, or actually it's a county in his case, and all of his poems have some sort of narrative element. Although he doesn't write exclusively narrative poems, but he writes a lot. He does write a lot of longer narrative poems. So, I'm thinking of Winesburg, Ohio, for example. It'd be something akin to that, but it's Mississinawa County, Indiana, which doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah.
It's a river, but
or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real river, but fake, but a made up fictionalized county. Anyway, he's a really interesting poet who I think nobody really talks about.
Yeah, his long poem in here was one of my favorites.
Which one was that?
The Shriving.
Right. Yeah. It's a kind of a haunting.
It's a crown, a sort of pseudo crown of sonnets.
Yeah. Pseudo crown, but also a narrative as well.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and in a way, like maybe we may get to it, but somewhat. I mean, in some ways I didn't know how much it needed to be a crown, but it did have a cyclical quality to it that it existed sort of outside of chronology.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you chose these partly as like some of these are just straight down the line canonical new formalists, and some are a little more peripheral to the group, but they're all of that older generation, because there are kind of like 3 or 4. I mean, I feel like they're now like 4 waves of because we don't, like, generations, we're so ridiculous with these now, where like we count a new generation every 15 years, but there's like the Gioia generation, the like Yazzie Stallings Megan generation, the like Austin Allen Ryan Wilson generation, and then like these fucking Taylor bias Alexis Sears whippersnappers who have no business publishing as much as they do, as good as the work they do, as young as they are.
I know. I think of myself when I was Alexis's age or something, and just like, oh my God, just the fact that she, publishes, as the centerpiece in her book Out of Order, this astonishingly good sonnet crown is I mean, it's
yeah, for her
just,
father.
I mean, she just has, in your terms, she just has no business
Right. Yeah.
being that good at
Slow
such
down,
a
Alexis. God
yeah.
damn it. Yeah.
But also Mary Jo Salter is in here, and Rena Espaillat, and Marilyn Nelson, David Mason, of course. I think I named everybody. And yeah, almost all of the poems in here, with the exception of, I don't know, maybe like 3 poems. You mentioned Joya, for example, are formal poems. So they are either mid-length blank verse narratives. I've included a few of those, or they're in meter and rhyme. So the exceptions, I guess, interestingly enough, are Dana Gioia's poems, and of course, Gioia writes in free verse a lot, as well as in meter and rhyme.
At least I'm trying to think, the first one seemed to me at least to be ostensibly in accentual
Demeter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think trimeter, though I don't know. It's hard to tell because, like, in some cases, I have great respect for him. I think his scansion is not the best. I think it's often almost the worst. But yeah, Sorry, go ahead.
I think he probably would look at this poem as being a kind of. I don't know if he would classify this as being metrical, as being even accentual. I think he would just say it's a free verse poem.
Yeah.
I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I would say he would probably classify this as a free verse poem.
Yeah. I would still take him to the Prosody Woodshed over Haunted, but yeah, which thinks that it's in blank verse. But yeah, you want to pick a poem to start with? Maybe we'll start. Maybe start with a shortish one, so we can get our feet wet.
Yeah, let's do that. Well, okay. So one idea might be to start with. I'm thinking of Cameron's, just absolute dismissal of R.S. Gwynne as being a light verse poet.
Yeah.
Which he certainly writes really accomplished light verse poems.
Yeah.
Also, a genre of poetry that
is a genre
isn't talked about very much these days.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of poets are writing light verse, Austin Allen, for example, is in his new manuscript that he's shopping around, has a really amazing light verse sequence, which is a sequence of limericks, which are really straddling that interesting line between, the tragic and the comic. Anyway, so
he's really good at that, and he also, I mean, on it was some occasion back when Slavery was briefly on Twitter, he on command very quickly came up with a brilliant tiny poem rhyming orange that perfectly rhyming, or that he is just technically really gifted and witty. His wit is pretty unparalleled among current new formalists. But so that makes that explains why the 2 R.S. Gwynne poems you sent were stone sober. I mean, the thing is, they're actually still sort of funny because he's funny, but they're funny in a heartbreaking way. I quite liked these. So
maybe I'll read At the Center, and maybe we can just talk about it for a second.
Yeah.
Excuse me. At the Center. The pianist is playing Debussy beside the lobby cappuccino bar. Soft smiles and pastels everywhere. You see, the point's not to remind you where you are or how you are. The point is not to dwell on thoughts like these. Look at this normal crowd, such as you'd find in any good hotel. But why does no one say its name out loud? Later, you pass through elevator doors. Rising to higher levels, you recall rumors you've heard of rumors from these floors. How some guests never leave. How they display a preference for short hair or none at all. How no one asks how long you plan to stay.
Yeah, this is a little sonnet, and is it English? No, not English.
It's sort of a hybrid.
Yeah. It's a hybrid. And this was one that I blew through the octave until I got to, but why does no one say its name out loud? And then had to actually, I'm very bad at reading poems cold, and so I had to sort of stop and then actually pay attention. And it's a poem in which, just like its subject matter, it's very sort of easy to whiz past without noticing what's happening.
Yeah.
Because at first, everything that's happening seems very bland and quotidian.
That's right.
By design.
And I think too, yeah, that's right. It's the eighth line which really starts to point us towards something a little more dire and at the very least noteworthy about
And it changes the emphasis of the previous line from, I think the first time I read "such as you'd find in any good hotel," the emphasis in my mind landed on any, right? Such as you'd find in any good hotel, just like this one. But of course, it's only after the eighth line you realize, it's not a hotel. It's any good hotel, rather than what this is.
That's right.
So go ahead.
And I think I love this poem for how well, as you're suggesting, how subtle it is. Also, there's a kind of I love the work that it's doing with the second person point of view, which is really, in spite of lots of writers trying it, it's really kind of a difficult point of view to pull off.
I mean, a lot of people just use it as a simple substitution for first person, but I think here he's making use of it a little more than he might otherwise. Yeah, it's not just one. But yeah, what do you? I keep interrupting you. Sorry, you actually can explain the. Yeah, go ahead.
No, not at all. I don't necessarily have any analytical revelations to make about this poem. Only that I admire its formal facility, and I admire the kind of. So I mentioned subtlety. So the one line, the third line of the sestet, for example, rumors you've heard of rumors from these floors. Of course. It's impossible not to hear one word, which is not actually said in the poem, which is tumors.
Yeah.
I mean, that echo, I think, is just brilliant and certainly intentional on Gwyn's part. Of course, we know that because of the subject matter and also because of the repetition of that word, rumors. I love too how kind of cold it is, or how cold it sort of seems.
Yeah.
There's a suggestiveness too, even to the title, at the center. At the center.
Right.
What?
That's the thing, is like, it's such a bland title. It's very easy, but it is, of course, this is the kind of place we call a center, just like there's certain places we call a facility, with a kind of a deliberate vagueness. And of course, it's also suggesting that there is something in the middle. There's something at the core of this, which it turns out is a thing that's never named.
Yes, exactly.
And that kind of beating around the bush, or sort of circling or avoiding the subject, I think, is consistent with his use of the second person, which really reminds me of another cancer themed piece of literature, the chapter / short story "You Could Be Anyone" in The Girl's Guide to Hunting and Fishing. Again, my favorite piece of secretly high art chick lit from the, I forget, late 90s, early 2000s. But it is in that, I think it's an entire section told in the second person. It's fiction, but the suggestion in that is, again, like, there is a very specific experience going on, but at the same time, it's one that is, in some sense, interchangeable with many others. That your personal identity doesn't matter so much. That what matters right now is the reason you're here.
That's right. Yeah. And in the way too that disease and death obliterate identity, and also just the seriousness and direness of the situation, which is never said directly. Another thing too, another sort of fact in the poem that is apropos of that understated title at the center is the and also the Gwyn's use of the second person POV is the fact that we never get an I in the poem.
Mm-hmm.
It's as if the poet, I don't know, he can't say I. He in a way, he can't confess whatever he, I don't know, what's the reason? Like, why are you writing this poem? Something is happening, in your life, poet. Something is happening. What is it that you're not telling us? And so in an act of, I don't know, it's at once an act of grace, but also an act of, like, not being able to do it, not having the strength to do it. He sort of, like, can't bring in his own autobiography, like, cannot reveal these details of like why he's writing this poem. Who is the you? Where is the I's place in this scene? Who is the you and who is the I at the center, in the center? So that's kind of I love that. I love that about it too.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's a vindication of a couple of points of debate. One, Cameron's emphasis as a reader, I think, is very much on the texture and quality of the language. And this is a poem in which, on the one hand, there's very little that you would call, explosive or, deliberately twisted or charged or compressed about the language. At the same time, I don't think there's really much wasted. And I think this would be a very different poem if paraphrased. And it's, to that point as well, I think something Shane wrote in an email, I'm actually going to respond to it more length in another episode, but he sort of attacked the suggestion that poetry should be about conveying information, which is what he read in some of my defenses. He said, it seems like what you want is information. And I think this is a poem in which, the information in the poem is paraphrased in even simpler terms than the poem itself, and terms the poem never bothers to use at all. I mean, this is a poem in which, in fact, the whole motion of the poem is never identifying the central or crucial information, but it is, this needs to be as it is. It needs to be as plain as it is. It needs to be as implicit as it is. And it's I think, it vindicates to me the value of voice in a lyric, which is really what I find that, as I get older, I have a harder and harder time really caring about poems that don't, in which I don't hear a human voice. And this one, even in that it is it's almost like the characterological equivalence of like Muzak. It's like a deliberately textureless voice, but it's still one in which there's a lot of, and that, I mean, I think that coldness that you talk about allows for all of the pain and actual, sympathy and anguish and love that is, at the heart of this thing to be suggested and implied and, pricked and prodded without ever being identified.
Yeah, and certainly not shouted like Hopkins' poems tend to do. I loved your anthology about the, it's like one of those emails where like the text is just bold like the whole time.
Yeah. Oh
This
man,
text,
yeah.
This text is not
shouted at times through a kazoo. One
Yeah.
Would you read this one more time just so people can get it in their heads, because I know my dad always says you need to read the poem twice, which I think he's mostly right about. Yeah.
At the center. The pianist is playing Debussy beside the lobby cappuccino bar. Soft smiles and pastels everywhere. You see, the point's not to remind you where you are or how you are. The point is not to dwell on thoughts like these. Look at this normal crowd, such as you'd find in any good hotel. But why does no one say its name out loud? Later, you pass through elevator doors. Rising to higher levels, you recall rumors you've heard of rumors from these floors. How some guests never leave. How they display a preference for short hair, or none at all. How no one asks how long you plan to stay.
Thank you. And once again, Sam, sorry, Cameron shit all over you. You're welcome to come on and yell if you like. What do you want to talk about next?
I think, well, you mentioned voice. I thought one of the comments that you and Cameron were making, I think maybe Cameron made it and you were responding to it, I can't remember, probably, was the fact that a lot of new formalists can sound very similar to each other in terms of voice.
Just quickly, because I also I have been torn over that and thinking about it since, and have written to some people about it. That's just an impulsive observation I've had, and I have it about my own work often. Like, I write poems and I think, even when they're at their best, it feels like, well, this part of its being at its best is the way in which it approaches this it's not impersonal, but I don't know. It's like unadulterated quality that some of the cleanest and best of contemporary formal verse has. What you're actually a scholar. What am I observing? Am I observing? Is that a real phenomenon? What's going on?
I'm not really a scholar, but
You have a lot of books behind you, and you teach at a university. You seem like a scholar. Yeah.
Fair enough. Elbow patches and everything, right? I don't know, but I would say in your poems and in the poems of others, I would say Gwyn's poem that we just read is an example of this too. The point is not a kind of flashiness of voice or tone. The point is to have, I don't know, it's almost like a willingness not to impose, the willingness not to shout in the reader's ear, but to have the reader come to the poem on his or her or their own terms, and appreciate the poem as, I don't know, it's a I think of it as a kind of, you don't want to impose this loud voice, this voice that makes loud sounds and sort of growls and shouts in the middle of the room. Look at me, this is me, hear me, sort of a thing. This is not at all a scholarly answer to your
no, but that is, I think there's something about it. There's some kind of distillation that happens, and it's true of like some of the poems I like best of like Edwin Arlington Robinson, or even like Edna St. Vincent Millay certainly has a certain sass and twang to some of her poems, but in some of her best, I think there is a real purity and clarity. And who's the guy I always fucking forget who only wrote sonnets, but they were really beautiful? Was it Trumbull Stickney? Is that the name I always forget?
Jones Very is one of those poets, sort of
I don't know Jones. I'll have to look up Jones Very.
He's a strange figure. He's a sort of lesser, very like the word, like very. You're like
okay.
Very,
like the word very.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Tumble Street. He was a contemporary, like a pretty much exact contemporary of Robinson too.
Okay.
Straight, not very was a contemporary of Emerson and Thoreau and those folks.
Okay, all right, but Trumbull Stickney. Who seems like one of those guys who existed sort of out of time. Who's the other one who I always place in the wrong century? Walter Savage Landor, is that his name?
Oh yeah.
I always think he's in the wrong and then I read him and I'm like, oh wait, you lived then?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was I actually, before we moved on, I wanted to quickly, because it did really. It was the odd, almost like achingly polite avoidance in this Gwyn poem did really remind me of. I'm going to just pull up real quick because we don't need to talk about it, but I'm just going to pull up because it really did bring it to mind, and I think it also is one of these, an example of this odd phenomenon of like such a pure, clear distillation that the voice seems to disappear. This is the very short poem "Down in the Valley" by Joshua Megan.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
It was her first time coming home from college. She headed downtown for a drink or two. Her girlfriend went home early. That was Christmas. Now, under sapling pine trees in the clearing, snowdrops are coming back to their old places. They had been gone a lifetime. Now they stand, poised like a choir on the verge of singing. Nature is just. There's nothing left to fear. The worst thing that can happen happened here. And other than maybe the lines like poised like a choir on the verge of singing, and then the kind of brutal nature is just, which do have a very particular ring to them. Most of the poem feels like it could be written by the same person who wrote the Gwyn poem, but not, but almost as a virtue. Yeah.
I think I often ask my students to, especially those who are new to poetry, to take a look at a poem, read it a couple of times, let it sit, and then go back and think about what sticks out in your mind as being noticeable. What are the conspicuous aspects of this poem? And so in both of the poems that we just looked at, the Megan and the Gwyn, it's certainly not voice. And in fact, maybe what sticks out the most is that nothing really sticks out.
Yeah.
until you let the poem wash over you a little bit and spend a little bit more time with the poem and think about it more, and then you realize it's the kind of, in the Megan poem, it's like the Gwyn poem, it's what isn't talked about that's the most conspicuous thing, which often happens in life, which is very much how we deal with grief sometimes. I shouldn't say we like the royal we, but certainly how some people deal with grief and tragedy.
Right, which is part of the I can't remember if I put this episode. I was talking to somebody recently about like that turning to poetry in times in which our lives become sort of iconic. The Larkin's phrase is, marriage and birth and death and thoughts of these. These are times when they are extremely intimate, extremely personal moments, but they're also the moments in which we are most like all of our ancestors and all of our descendants. We are most like anybody else who also is born and dies and mourns. It's funny, the I don't know if you have read the newest Shane McCrae book, the Pain Named the Animal. I feel like he often like chooses his titles in order to like almost like put a Zen koan in your head, like what am I like? Sometimes I never suffered. What? How? But Pain Named the Animal, which like then only really makes sense when you read the poem. But his one of my favorite poems in there, I think, is a beautiful little poem about Eurydice. It's like did we need another Eurydice poem? And he strangely like does something really lovely with it. But I remember talking to Cameron, I think that was his least favorite because it had some of this like extremely distilled quality to it. In some ways, it was like the least McCrae-ish poem in the book. But again, like with this sort of funny virtue. But yeah, sorry, I've derailed. Let's get us back to your anthology. What's
Anyway, I wanted to look so that we can get a poet whose voice is a little bit more, I don't know, where voice is a little bit more privileged or noticeable in the poem. It's more of a thing that the poet is focusing on, more of a focus of the poem. I wanted to look at one of Mary Jo Salter's poems. So I include three here: The Reader, The Age of Reason, and Trompe l'oeil. So I don't know. We should look at, I think, either The Reader or The Age of Reason. So The Age of Reason is an earlier poem of hers. So the New Formalists, one of the ways in which one of the things they were responding to, just like the language poets, was basically the confessionalism, the confessional I, and the focus on the autobiographical I. Cameron made a comment to the effect of like, oh, well, the New Formalists, like all of their lyric poems are autobiographical. Yeah, that's not entirely true, but that is true to a certain extent. But I would say, yeah, but the focus isn't on the self. The focus is on, issues beyond the self. The situation happens to be, and sometimes even the narrative happens to be based on autobiographical material, sure. But the poem is not about that centrally, In other words, it's not about the growth of the poet's mind or something, or confessing something shameful about the poet's past, etc.
Sharon Old style, yeah.
Yeah.
I do wonder with that kind of remark because you in your long essay pointed to, I think, some really good examples of poets in this broader category taking on sort of thorny subjects that are maybe matter to them personally, but aren't really part of their personal histories. I wonder as the I don't know, movement is such a silly word, but like as that category has passed on to other generations, I do wonder if it has become a little less adventurous in subject matter. Like there are poets, Ryan writes these poems that are very far removed from his own experience, but I think I see more, I think Cameron's comment is actually more true with regard to the younger formalists.
Yeah, and that's true of someone like Sears for sure. She writes really compellingly about her own stories, her own life. But yeah, they are sort of, if there's one criticism that, someone like Cameron might like to make, or might like to, sort of scratch at or pick on, Yeah, that might be something.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
let's look at
it is an interesting point, and I've thought about it myself too. But I think those of us who spend sometimes years writing, for example, dramatic monologues in which the voice is very far from our own
right.
experience. For instance, this just came to mind because it's a kind of obvious example, even though no one knows this poem. It's in my forthcoming book, but it's a poem. Okay, so here's my getting sidetracked now a little bit. Here's
Please.
my
That's
argument.
the whole point of podcast is to constantly get sidetracked and never get to your actual subject matter. Yeah, go ahead.
That's why it's so much fun to listen to. It's like, where's the payoff? Where's the
Never. There is no payoff. Go fuck yourself.
I have an idea about dramatic monologue. I don't know if this is original to me. I don't know if it's an original thought. It probably isn't, of course. But my idea is that the further a poet gets from his or her own autobiographical experience in writing dramatic monologues, the closer they actually get to their own experience. So, in other words, it's a way of, you could almost think of it as a way of confessing, of even writing in a kind of confessional mode, but without using your own experience as the kind of focal point. Or another way of putting that is that it's only possible to write about this material in your own life or in your own psyche by getting outside of that and sort of displacing all of that business onto another character,
Yeah.
So I think of really sort of extreme examples like Frank Baudard's Herbert White, which is about necrophiliac serial killer.
Yeah.
Really just one of the best dramatic monologues, certainly of the 20th century. And also, I still cannot, this book was probably, or that poem was probably published in, I think it's, I don't know, let's call it 1970 or 1969 or something.
Yeah.
But the point is that it's the first poem in Baudard's first book, which is Herbert fucking White. I mean, like, the balls on this guy.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking of like Maury Creech. I guess it's his second book. It was the first book of this I read in field. Fuck, is it field work or field notes? Damn it.
Oh yeah.
Fuck, but yeah, it's a great book. But he has a couple poems where he talks about Pee Wee Reese, who's like a horrifying serial killer.
Right.
But yeah, it would be like that, except it's just he just started the book with that in the first person.
Yeah,
oh.
That's right. And so like, I have this poem in my new book, which is coming out in February, called Mrs. Baumeister, which is a poem in the voice of the wife of a serial killer, or I should say an accused serial killer. He killed himself before he could ever go to trial. But he had a wife and 2 kids, and they lived north of Indianapolis. This is in the 1990s. And so what Herb Baumeister would do is he would go kind of prowling. He would leave his house, kiss his wife and kids or whatever, leave his house and go and pick up gay men and bring them, at various bars and whatever, and then lure them back to his house north of Indianapolis and, have his way with them. And then he would murder them and burn them and scatter them in his backyard, which was a big, like an old horse farm. And so,
what do you think was happening out there?
I know. He's
doing a barbecue every night, and you never serve dinner. Like, what's going on? What is? You're burning bodies.
I know, it's insane.
Christ.
So anyway, so I
not to blame her, but like, good God, that's amazing.
I
do it nothing for. Oh!
I know, it's crazy, but anyway, but one of the reasons, I mean, maybe the entire reason that I wrote this poem was because my wife, who I've known since we were both 23 years old, she grew up down the street from the fucking Baumeisters.
Oh my God.
So she was around, and this is in the 90s. We're both 44. So we were coming of age in the 90s, and so my wife would ride the school bus with Baumeister's kids. It's so crazy. Anyway, and so
anyway. What's the you got to plug your book properly. What's the name of your book that's coming out?
It's called Some Problems with Autobiography. And,
yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And it won the 2022 New Criterion Prize. It's coming out with Criterion Books in February. And so the official release date is February 28th, I believe. But if you want, you can. It's available for purchase for pre-order.
Okay, we'll put a link in the show notes. And you're the key, because this is the New Criterion does their prize, and they put out whatever press they work with puts out one of these every year, and they're like solid, handsome hardcover books. The trick is they all have the same. It's like a lot of these contests. They all have the same design. The question is, which colors did you get? Because some look great and some look like dog shit. So what did you do? Are you pink and green? What do you have?
Yeah. Well, I showed. So this here's the.
Okay. That's actually not bad.
Everybody, we're on. Matthew and I are on Zoom, so we can can see each other. But,
okay, that actually looks like a respectable look. I should note, especially with pastels, I'm colorblind enough that it might look horrible, and I wouldn't know, but it looks fine to me. That was the first half of my conversation with Brian Brodeur. If you'd like to hear the second half, then sign up for the secret show. Go to sleeverickets.substack.com. You can get a week's access for free. And then it's still pretty cheap after that for 3 extra episodes a month, including the second half of this conversation, which will be up there in the next couple days. Thank you for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleeverickets@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.